You won't believe this, the hidden world of meth. What if I told you that a single chemical once used to fuel soldiers in battle is now wreaking havoc across the globe? A substance so powerful it can keep you awake for days, drain your body, and hijack your mind. Yet millions of people still chase its high every day. This isn't just a story about a drug. It's a story of ambition, secrecy, and human vulnerability. From secret laboratories in post-war Japan and Germany to the jungles of Southeast Asia, and now the streets of North America, Europe, and Australia, methamphetamine has evolved into a global epidemic. Cartels industrialized its production. Small towns were overtaken. Communities collapsed. Families were torn apart. And the worst part? Its spread is relentless, adapting faster than authorities can keep up. But there's more to this story than just destruction. It's about resilience, recovery, and the hidden truths behind one of the most addictive substances on the planet. Stay with us, because the journey through methamphetamine's history, its impact, and its secrets will shock you and reveal why this chemical continues to shape lives worldwide. Ancient origins of stimulants and early ephedra. Long before the world knew the word methamphetamine, long before laboratories, chemists, or global epidemics, humanity had already discovered something important: the power of plants that could change energy, focus, and alertness. In almost every corner of the ancient world, different civilizations sought ways to stay awake longer, breathe easier, or feel more capable during harsh conditions. These early experiments laid the foundation for what would one day become the modern history of synthetic stimulants. The story begins not with chemicals, but with nature, and with one small, unassuming plant, ephedra. The ancient world and the search for energy. For as long as people have worked, hunted, fought, or traveled, they have needed tools to push their physical limits. Food, rest, and herbal remedies were central to survival. Desert traders who crossed long distances often chewed aromatic roots or seeds to stay alert through the night. Mountain tribes brewed teas from leaves that opened their airways in thin, cold air. In many cultures, the connection between plants and endurance was considered a kind of natural wisdom. Something passed from elder to apprentice, from healer to healer. Among these ancient botanists were the early physicians of China, Central Asia, India, and the Middle East. Their writings reflect a deep curiosity about how plants affected the human body. Some herbs soothed pain, some induced sleep, and some, like ephedra, awakened the senses. Ma-huang, China's ancient medical treasure. Ephedra, known in ancient China as ma-huang, holds one of the longest continuous medical histories of any plant in the world. Records go back nearly 5,000 years, appearing in the earliest Chinese herbal texts. The legendary pharmacopoeia Shennong Ben Cao Jing described ma-huang as a plant used to treat breathing difficulties, fatigue, cold-induced illness, blocked airways. These were not recreational uses. They were medical, rooted in survival. In cold northern regions, winter illnesses could be deadly. Healers found that ma-huang opened the lungs and allowed laborers, hunters, and soldiers to breathe more freely. Its energizing effect became known through daily life, not through experimentation. The preparation was simple: dried stems boiled into tea. No refining, no concentration, just a natural herb whose properties were observed over centuries, spreading across civilizations. Though China documented ephedra most extensively, it was not alone in discovering its effects. Various species of ephedra grew from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, and each culture found its own use for it. In Persia and the Middle East, ephedra was used in ritual and medicinal herbal mixtures. In Central Asia, nomadic tribes used the plant to stay alert during long journeys across vast plains. In parts of India, traditional Ayurvedic texts mention similar herbs that energize the body and improve breathing. Every culture gave the plant a different name, but all recognized its dual nature, a medicine that revived the tired and strengthened the weak. Roots of scientific curiosity. These early traditions did more than help ancient people. They shaped the scientific curiosity of later generations. For thousands of years, ephedra's effects were known, respected, and recorded. When ancient manuscripts were rediscovered in later eras, scholars and explorers took note, carrying specimens back to their homelands. By the 18th and 19th centuries, European scientists began analyzing medicinal plants described in Asian texts. This curiosity reflects a key moment in history, the shift from herbal observation to chemical investigation. Scholars wanted to know why a plant like ma-huang worked. What gave it its power? What compound created the feeling of expanded breath? These questions would eventually lead chemists to isolate the active ingredients found naturally inside ephedra. That step, the step from plant to molecule, marked the beginning of a new chapter in stimulant history. But long before chemistry, there was simply the lived experience of ordinary people. Human needs in harsh environments. In the ancient world, life was physically demanding, and stimulants played a role in endurance. Shepherds guarding their flocks through the night needed alertness. Messengers traveling long distances needed stamina. Hunters needed clear breath and sharp focus. Before clocks and machines, time was measured by nature, and nature, sometimes, needed a little assistance. Ephedra was not seen as a shortcut or an escape. It was viewed as a useful companion in daily struggle. A tea brewed from ma-huang could help a laborer work through cold winds or help a soldier stay awake on guard duty. Many ancient users likely never questioned how it worked, only that it worked. Medicine, ritual, and symbolism. Stimulant plants often carried symbolic meaning. In some cultures, they represented fire, wind, or life force. In others, they were sacred gifts from nature. In ancient China, ma-huang was seen as a warming plant in traditional medicine. Its stimulating effect was interpreted as a restoration of balance, a renewal of inner energy. In Central Asian rituals, ephedra sometimes played a role in ceremonial preparations, serving as a component in mixtures meant to promote clarity of mind or purity of breath. These symbolic associations show how deeply the plant was woven into cultural identity. It was not merely medicine. It was part of mythology, ritual, and belief. Lessons passed through generations. For thousands of years, the knowledge of ephedra survived, not because of science, but because of storytelling. Elders taught younger healers. Travelers shared remedies from distant lands. Farmers learned which seasons produced the most potent stems. The plant's effects were not secrets. They were traditions. A natural beginning to a complex history. This first chapter of stimulant history is gentle compared to what would come later. Here, ephedra is simply a plant, a remedy from the earth, used with respect and necessity. Its role in ancient societies reflects human resilience and the eternal search for ways to overcome physical limits. This natural beginning contrasts sharply with the future story of synthetic stimulants, where laboratories, wars, and addiction will dramatically reshape the world. But to understand that complex future, we must first understand the simplicity of the past. A time when a small desert plant carried enough power to change lives, save lives, and spark the curiosity that would lead humanity into a new scientific age. Discovery of amphetamine and birth of methamphetamine. As the 19th century drew toward its end, the world was changing rapidly. Empires were expanding, industrial cities were rising, and science was transforming everyday life. Electricity illuminated the night, steam powered factories, and medicine was entering a new era, the era of chemistry. Traditional remedies, once based on observation and experience, were now being examined under microscopes and separated into individual components. This moment in history formed the bridge between old herbal knowledge and modern synthetic science. Among the many plants being studied by chemists was ephedra, the same plant that had been used for thousands of years in traditional Chinese medicine. Scientists had long known about its energizing and airway-opening effects, but they did not yet understand why it worked. And in the laboratories of the late 1800s, that question sparked a wave of curiosity. The rise of organic chemistry. By the late 19th century, organic chemistry, the chemistry of carbon-based compounds, was rapidly advancing. Scientists had learned how to isolate, purify, and identify active ingredients from plants. Quinine was isolated from cinchona bark to treat malaria. Morphine was extracted from poppy sap. Cocaine was purified from coca leaves. This scientific success encouraged researchers to look deeper into other medicinal plants, especially those known for stimulating the body. The question was simple: could these natural chemicals be imitated or improved? This mindset, the desire to understand and replicate nature, would eventually lead to the creation of amphetamine and later methamphetamine. Early efforts to understand ephedra. In the 1880s, German and Japanese chemists began carefully studying ephedra plants. Their goal was not to create harmful substances. Instead, they aimed to understand how its natural compound could help patients with asthma, congestion, and fatigue. At the time, breathing disorders were common and dangerous, especially before antibiotics. A plant that could open the lungs was of enormous medical interest. One of the chemists captivated by this plant was a Japanese scientist named Nagai Nagayoshi. Nagai Nagayoshi, a pioneer of early stimulant chemistry. Nagai Nagayoshi, born in 1844, studied in both Japan and Germany. In Europe, he was exposed to the rapidly growing field of organic chemistry and returned to Japan with a vision to bring modern scientific methods into Japanese research. When he examined ephedra, he wanted to isolate its active chemical to better understand and possibly improve it. In 1893, Nagai achieved a breakthrough. He successfully extracted a substance from ephedra that he named ephedrine. This compound could mimic many of the effects of the plant itself, and it represented one of the earliest examples of a natural stimulant being understood at the molecular level. Ephedrine quickly became recognized as medically valuable. It could help with breathing issues and sometimes increase alertness. But isolating a natural substance was only the first step. Chemists now wondered, if nature produced this molecule, could they create a similar or perhaps stronger version in the laboratory? The birth of synthetic stimulants. The late 1800s were full of scientific optimism. Chemists believed that if they could understand the structure of a natural molecule, they could recreate it or slightly modify it to study its effects. This was not viewed as dangerous. Instead, it was seen as a way to explore new medical possibilities. In 1887, the German chemist Lazar Edeleanu synthesized a compound called amphetamine for the first time. At the time, no one thought much of it. It was simply one of many new chemical discoveries. There were no major experiments, no immediate medical applications, and no public attention. It sat quietly in scientific literature, waiting for the world to rediscover it decades later. But the creation of amphetamine was an important milestone. It was the first purely synthetic stimulant of its kind. It marked a turning point where chemistry no longer needed to depend entirely on plants to create new compounds. From amphetamine to methamphetamine. After Nagai isolated ephedrine, he remained interested in understanding how it worked. He wondered if the structure of ephedrine could inspire new synthetic compounds. In 1919, building on earlier chemistry, Nagai succeeded in creating a new compound by modifying the ephedrine molecule. This new synthetic stimulant was methamphetamine. At the time of its creation, methamphetamine was not made for misuse. It was simply part of a wider scientific exploration of medicinal chemistry. Chemists believed they were expanding the possibilities of medicine, and in many ways, they were. Synthetic compounds could be tested, measured, and standardized in ways that natural plants could not. No one in 1919 imagined the global consequences that this substance would one day have. Scientific curiosity, not malice. It is important to understand the mindset of the scientists of the era. Their intentions were not harmful. Diseases like asthma, pneumonia, and respiratory infections were major killers, especially among children. A substance that could open the lungs or increase breathing ability had enormous potential. During these years, medicine was still fighting to understand the human body. Stimulants seemed promising because they could increase wakefulness, improve breathing, raise energy, combat fatigue. These were seen as beneficial traits, especially in a world without many modern treatments. The concepts of addiction and long-term side effects were less understood. Many medicines of the era, including morphine and early sedatives, were prescribed without full knowledge of their risks. Synthetic chemistry moved faster than medical caution. The early 20th century, a foundation is laid. By the early 1900s, the basic pieces of the stimulant story were in place. Ephedra had been understood through centuries of traditional use. Ephedrine had been isolated as a natural stimulant. Amphetamine had been created synthetically. Methamphetamine had been synthesized by modifying ephedrine. What remained was for the world to discover these substances and to find uses for them far beyond what the original scientists expected. Important discoveries set the stage for a dramatic shift in the decades to come. When pharmaceutical companies, military organizations, and governments eventually learned about these new stimulants, they would find in them a tool that could change human performance in profound ways. And in the process, the world would step into a new era, an era where synthetic chemistry could reshape society, influence war, alter culture, and eventually create long-lasting global problems. But in the quiet laboratories of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, none of this was known. There were only glass beakers, simple tools, and dedicated scientists trying to understand the natural world. Their work was meticulous, careful, and guided by curiosity. They could not foresee how their discoveries would evolve once they left the laboratory and entered the hands of industry, governments, and eventually the public. This chapter of history is the calm before the storm, a moment where science is innocent, progress is celebrated, and the world unknowingly approaches a future shaped by molecules that were originally created to heal. 1920s, 1930s, meth becomes a medicine. The decades between the 1920s and the 1930s were years of enormous global transformation. The world had just emerged from World War I. Nations were rebuilding, economies were shifting, and science was advancing at a speed never seen before. It was a time of hope, invention, and medical progress. In this climate of optimism, new synthetic compounds, including amphetamine and methamphetamine, entered the world of modern medicine. Even though methamphetamine had been synthesized in 1919, it was not yet widely known. The scientific papers describing it sat quietly in university libraries. Yet the stage was set for something significant: the movement of laboratory discoveries into pharmacies, doctors' offices, and eventually into the hands of millions. The medical revolution of the early 20th century. To understand why methamphetamine became a medicine, one must understand the medical landscape of the time. In the early 20th century, antibiotics like penicillin were still years away. Asthma, bronchitis, and respiratory infections were common and dangerous. Fatigue, depression, and lack of energy were widespread in populations recovering from war. There was a strong cultural belief that science could fix almost anything. Doctors needed new treatments. Pharmaceutical companies needed new products. The world wanted new solutions, and stimulants, with their ability to increase alertness and open airways, appeared to be promising tools. Amphetamine arrives first. While methamphetamine had been created earlier, it was amphetamine that first entered commercial use. In 1929, an American scientist named Gordon Alice rediscovered amphetamine while testing its ability to relieve nasal congestion. He took small experimental doses himself, a common but risky practice in those days, and felt a clear sense of stimulation and increased alertness. Word of these effects spread quickly through scientific circles. Soon after, pharmaceutical companies saw an opportunity. In 1932, the first major amphetamine product entered the market in the United States: the Benzedrine inhaler. It was advertised as a treatment for nasal congestion, asthma, colds, allergies. The inhaler was simple: a small tube containing amphetamine vapors. It was sold without a prescription and quickly became popular. People felt it opened their lungs and cleared their sinuses. What they also felt, and what made it even more attractive, was the subtle lift in mood, and this success created a demand for stimulants, and soon attention turned to methamphetamine. Japan brings methamphetamine into medicine. Methamphetamine's first major commercial introduction came from Japan. In the 1930s, Japanese pharmaceutical researchers recognized methamphetamine's stimulant properties and potential medical uses. One company, Dai Nippon Pharmaceutical, began refining and producing it under the trade name Pervitin. It was marketed as a treatment for fatigue, a mood lifter, a respiratory aid, a stimulant for alertness. At the time, These claims did not seem unusual. Many medicines were marketed for broad emotional and physical benefits. The standards of medical testing were very different from today. Methamphetamine became widely available in tablets, small bottles, and later in other forms. Japanese doctors used it in clinical settings, believing it could help with asthma, narcolepsy, depression, low energy, stress-related exhaustion. The idea of risks, dependency, or long-term harm was not yet deeply understood. Stimulants were seen as modern tools, efficient, scientific, and effective. Medicine meets modernity. The 1920s and 1930s were defined by a cultural fascination with energy and productivity. The world was electrified. Cars replaced horses, factories ran through the night, and cities became centers that never slept. A drug that allowed people to stay awake longer seemed perfectly aligned with the spirit of the age. It was not only laborers who felt tired, society itself felt tired. The aftermath of World War I, the pressures of modernization, and the early stages of global industrial work culture created widespread exhaustion. Stimulants, marketed as pep pills or energy tonics, were promoted as solutions for everyday struggles. Ads promised clarity of mind, renewed vitality, increased efficiency. These claims made sense in a world that expected more and more productivity from its citizens. Methamphetamine expands into Europe. By the mid-1930s, methamphetamine had spread beyond Japan. German companies, especially the large pharmaceutical manufacturer Temmler, began producing and marketing it aggressively throughout Europe. They also used the name Pervitin, which soon became familiar among doctors and patients. It was sold in pharmacies much like modern cold medicine. Physicians prescribed it widely for low morale, fatigue during long work hours, short-term depression, seasonal sadness, respiratory conditions. This widespread medical use established methamphetamine as a legitimate pharmaceutical product. In many ways, the 1930s were its golden age as a medicine. Early warnings that went unnoticed. Even during this period of acceptance, a small number of doctors noticed troubling signs. Some patients returned too frequently, asking for refills. Others reported insomnia, restlessness, or elevated heart rate. But in the 1930s, these concerns were often dismissed. There were several reasons. Limited scientific knowledge, addiction science was still developing. Cultural optimism. Society believed all problems had scientific solutions. Economic pressure. Pharmaceutical companies thrived on expanding sales. Medical needs. Doctors lacked alternatives to treat certain conditions. Because of these factors, early warnings were not widely acted upon. The intersection of medicine and military interest. As the 1930s progressed, the world moved closer to another major conflict. Nations were rearming, training soldiers, and preparing for the possibility of war. In this tense environment, the stimulating effects of methamphetamine drew interest from military researchers. This interest would soon transform methamphetamine's role dramatically. Although still presented as a medicine, it was becoming something else. A strategic tool that might enhance endurance, alertness, and performance during long missions. This transition from pharmacy to military would become a defining moment in the history of methamphetamine. But during the 1930s, the public remained largely unaware of this shift. For them, it was still simply a medicine, one that promised energy, clarity, and relief, a world unaware of what was coming. In hindsight, it is easy to see the future consequences of methamphetamine's introduction into medicine. But at the time, the world saw it as a modern miracle, a symbol of scientific progress. It was affordable, accessible, and effective in the short term. Doctors wrote prescriptions without hesitation. Patients took the pills without suspicion. No one imagined that within a decade, the same drug would be issued to soldiers by the million. During World War II, no one foresaw that it would later become an illegal substance associated with serious social problems. And no one predicted that it would spread across continents and decades, evolving into one of the most challenging drug epidemics in modern history. The 1920s and 1930s were a chapter of hope, a moment when methamphetamine belonged to medicine, not to conflict or crisis. It was a time when science was trusted completely, and when the boundaries between beneficial and harmful were still unclear. This chapter marks the calm before the storm, a moment of innovation and optimism that would soon lead to one of the most dramatic and impactful transformations in the history of modern stimulants. World War II, the secret war drug. When the world entered World War II, it stepped into one of the most intense and demanding conflicts in human history. Nations mobilized entire populations. Factories operated around the clock. Soldiers fought across continents. And military leaders searched for any advantage that might help their forces endure the immense physical and psychological strain of war. This pressure created a unique environment, one where medicine, science, and military necessity collided. Among the tools nations turned to was a stimulant that had quietly risen in popularity during the 1930s, methamphetamine. What began as a medicine became almost overnight a strategic asset. The story of methamphetamine in World War II is not a sensational one, but rather a reflection of the desperate, exhausting nature of total war. A war that demanded constant alertness, endless endurance, and sometimes superhuman levels of effort from millions of ordinary people. War demands endless wakefulness. World War II was not fought only in daylight hours. Battles raged at night. Long journeys across oceans had no breaks, and air missions could last more than a full day without sleep. Soldiers often slept in trenches, tanks, submarines, or freezing mountain passes. Traditional military strategies were replaced with campaigns that pushed human limits. In this environment, staying awake was not a luxury. It was a matter of survival. A moment of fatigue could mean a missed radio message, a lost navigational point, or vulnerability to surprise attack. It was during these long stretches of sleeplessness that military planners began considering pharmaceutical stimulants as a tool to enhance endurance. Methamphetamine, already known to doctors, became attractive to militaries because of its ability to increase alertness, reduce feelings of fatigue, boost morale, sustain attention for long missions. While armies had used stimulants in earlier wars, such as caffeine and even coca-based tonics, methamphetamine represented something far stronger and more modern. And in a world war defined by machinery, speed, and exhaustion, it captured military interest quickly. Germany and the Pervitin program. One of the most documented examples of wartime stimulant use comes from Germany. By the late 1930s, the German pharmaceutical company Temmler had begun producing methamphetamine tablets under the name Pervitin. The drug had already found its way into civilian life as a wakefulness pill. But military officials saw a new opportunity. Before long, Pervitin tablets were distributed widely among German troops. They appeared in soldier medical kits, ration packs, pilot supplies, tank crew compartments. Commanders believed that methamphetamine could keep soldiers alert for long marches, all-night operations, and extended battles. In some early campaigns, rapid advances were partially attributed to the sustained wakefulness of troops. But behind these tactical advantages were human stories, soldiers who marched for days with little rest, pilots who flew mission after mission without stopping, and workers in munitions factories who relied on stimulants to meet impossible production demands. The military mindset of the time prioritized immediate effectiveness over long-term health consequences, which were not yet well understood. Japan's use of stimulants during the war. Japan, having been one of the earliest adopters of methamphetamine as a medicine, also incorporated it into military life. Under trade names such as Philippon, methamphetamine was provided to pilots, sailors, soldiers in remote outposts, factory workers producing military equipment. Japan's wartime environment was especially demanding. Long sea voyages, tropical campaigns, and high-stress conditions made exhaustion a constant threat. Stimulants were seen as practical tools to sustain endurance and prevent collapse during critical operation. Historical records also indicate that some civilians, particularly those working in heavy industry, were encouraged to use stimulants to meet the intense demands of wartime production. In a society locked in total war, the lines between military necessity and civilian life were blurred. The Allied powers, while Germany and Japan are often highlighted, they were not the only nations exploring stimulants. Allied nations, including the United States and the United Kingdom, also distributed amphetamines, primarily benzedrine, to pilots, long-range sailors, and soldiers undertaking exhausting missions. In air combat, where missions could last more than 20 hours, maintaining focus was critical. Allied bomber crews, for example, sometimes used stimulants during long-range operations to reduce the risk of fatigue-related errors. These decisions were made with the same reasoning seen across all militaries. War demanded constant vigilance, and stimulants were viewed as tools to prolong human capability. However, even among allies, concerns eventually arose about dependence, side effects, and the emotional strain caused by prolonged stimulant use. Reports surfaced of soldiers experiencing difficulty sleeping, increased anxiety, or emotional instability after extended missions. These observations were early indications of the risks associated with stimulant misuse. Risks the world would only fully appreciate decades later. War factories and home front labor. The war was not fought solely on battlefields. It was also fought in factories, shipyards, and supply lines. The demand for weapons, vehicles, and military equipment was unprecedented. Workers often labored through the night to meet production targets. In several countries, stimulants made their way into the industrial workforce, not always through official channels, but sometimes through scientific recommendation or workplace culture. Efficiency was prioritized above all else, and workers sought anything that could help them stay awake during long shifts. The war economy consumed enormous human energy, and stimulants provided a temporary solution. The human cost of endless effort. In the short term, methamphetamine appeared to solve the problem of fatigue. Soldiers could march farther, pilots could stay focused longer, and factory workers could continue through the night. But the long-term effects of repeated stimulant use were not well understood at the time. historians now recognize several human costs: emotional strain from prolonged wakefulness, exhaustion after periods of overstimulation, difficulty returning to normal sleep cycles, declining morale after the initial stimulating effects wore off, cases of dependency or misuse. These consequences were not fully documented during the war, but personal letters, diaries, and later medical studies reveal the toll that stimulant-heavy operations had on individuals. Many soldiers describe feeling emotionally drained, restless, or unable to sleep when rest finally came. Others reported periods of heightened anxiety or mood swings. In a war that already placed immense psychological pressure on combatants, stimulants became both an aid and a burden. After the war, a lingering legacy. When World War II ended in 1945, millions of people around the world had been exposed to wartime stimulants. For many soldiers, the end of the war brought relief, but also a difficult readjustment to civilian life. Some had become accustomed to artificial alertness. Others struggled with exhaustion after years of disrupted sleep cycles and high-pressure missions. In Japan and parts of Europe, leftover wartime supplies of methamphetamine leaked into civilian markets. This contributed to early post-war stimulant misuse in the late 1940s and 1950s, marking one of the first modern drug epidemics. Governments soon responded with regulations, restrictions, and public health campaigns. The wartime use of methamphetamine became a turning point, a moment when a pharmaceutical product crossed over into widespread, non-medical global use, driven by the extraordinary circumstances of war. War as a catalyst. World War II accelerated science, technology, medicine, industry, and unfortunately, widespread stimulant use. Methamphetamine's role in war did not begin with malicious intent. It began with a genuine desire to keep soldiers alive and alert. But like many powerful tools, its use expanded beyond its original purpose. The story of methamphetamine in World War II is a story of extremes. Extreme stress, extreme fatigue, extreme demands on human endurance. It shaped the trajectory of stimulant use for decades to come, influencing medicine. Stockpiles of unused meth didn't simply vanish. They leaked into civilian life, often falling into the hands of smugglers, opportunists, and underground pharmacies. This was the beginning of methamphetamine's transformation from a military stimulant into a global narcotics problem. One of the earliest post-war hotspots was Japan. During the war, the country manufactured enormous quantities of meth for the military. After surrendering in 1945, thousands of ampules and tablets were left unused, stored in warehouses with little oversight. As poverty spiked in the post-war years, these surplus supplies began drifting into black markets. By the late 1940s, Japan was facing its first methamphetamine epidemic. Young people, unemployed workers, and even demobilized soldiers turned to the drug for energy and escape. The government eventually outlawed the substance in 1951. But by then, a pattern had been set. Methamphetamine could spread quickly wherever economic instability and weak regulation existed. In the United States, the post-war years brought a different kind of transformation. Returning veterans, long-distance truck drivers, and factory workers were drawn to methamphetamine's ability to fight fatigue. In the 1950s and 60s, pharmaceutical companies even marketed legal meth pills for conditions like obesity and depression. Although these products were regulated, The widespread availability of their chemical ingredients gave rise to early underground production. Small, clandestine labs began appearing, often run by bikers or fringe criminal groups, who sold the drug in local markets, particularly along the West Coast. The U.S. had not yet realized that meth would become one of its most difficult drug crises. Across Asia, the picture was similar, but often even more extreme. In Southeast Asia, particularly the Golden Triangle region, where Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar meet, the drug trade already had deep roots thanks to opium production. The early 1980s and early 1990s, reports of yaba tablets began to rise, especially in Thailand and Myanmar. These early networks would later grow into some of the most powerful meth trafficking organizations in the world. The collapse of colonial empires reshaped borders and created new opportunities for smuggling routes. After the French withdrew from Indochina, after the British dismantled their Asian holdings, after the Dutch left Indonesia, and after the Americans ended their war in Vietnam, a new reality emerged. Vast regions were left with weakened institutions, flourishing corruption, and armed groups seeking money. Methamphetamine, cheap to produce and easy to transport, became a lucrative alternative to traditional narcotics. By the late 20th century, criminal syndicates in countries like Thailand, the Philippines, and Cambodia were scaling up operations, supplying not just local demand, but regional markets. In Europe, methamphetamine's rise was slower but steady. For decades, heroin dominated the continent's drug scene, but meth began spreading through underground chemists trained in Eastern Europe. After the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, several post-communist countries faced economic collapse, unemployment, and weak law enforcement. This provided fertile ground for criminal organizations to expand. Methamphetamine manufacturing began appearing in the Czech Republic, Poland, and neighboring countries, producing a form of meth locally known as Pervitin. Over time, these labs evolved from small kitchen operations to more organized networks that transported meth across Europe. A similar story unfolded in Australia and New Zealand, where meth, known locally as ice, became one of the most abused illicit drugs. The region's geographic isolation made it difficult and expensive for cartels to ship heroin or cocaine. But methamphetamine, with its compact size and high potency, became an attractive alternative. Local criminal groups partnered with Asian networks to smuggle meth across the vast Pacific. By the 2000s, large seizures of high-purity meth arriving from China, Hong Kong, and later Myanmar revealed just how deeply international trafficking had taken root. The true global shift, however, came with the emergence of organized transnational cartels. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Mexican drug organizations, already deeply involved in the cocaine trade, recognized methamphetamine's enormous profit potential. They recruited chemists, refined production methods, and began manufacturing meth at industrial scale. The proximity to the U.S. market made Mexico the perfect source country. Even when American laws restricted access to precursor chemicals like pseudoephedrine, Mexican cartels adapted quickly, finding new suppliers in China and India, and shifting production deeper into remote regions. By the 2000s, the global methamphetamine trade was no longer a loose network of local dealers. It had become a massive, multinational enterprise involving chemical suppliers in Asia, megalabs in Mexico, distribution networks across Europe, and street-level markets in almost every major city. The drug's purity increased dramatically while prices dropped, making meth more accessible than ever before. International agencies like Interpol and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime warned that meth trafficking was expanding faster than any other illicit drug market. The 21st century brought an additional challenge: the rise of synthetic drugs in general. Unlike cocaine or heroin, which require crops and agriculture, methamphetamine depends on chemistry, making it harder to control at the source. Criminal networks could move their labs from country to country, shifting operations. Whenever enforcement increased, they could purchase precursor chemicals from legal industries, disguise them as other products, and ship them across borders. The versatility of meth production, combined with the enormous demand, turned it into a global epidemic. Today, methamphetamine trafficking spans every continent, from Southeast Asia's powerful drug syndicates to Mexican cartels exporting high-purity ice, to Eastern European chemists supplying regional markets. The trade has become one of the most complex illicit industries in the world. The global spread of meth after World War II wasn't sudden. It unfolded step by step, driven by economic turmoil, political instability, opportunistic criminal groups, and an ever-expanding demand for stimulation and escape. This chapter in meth's history shows a troubling truth. Once a drug enters the fabric of global commerce and crime, it rarely disappears. Instead, it evolves, adapts, and finds new pathways, much like the world itself in the decades after the war. How meth became a global epidemic. When we talk about methamphetamine today, we speak of it as a global epidemic, one that has reached into cities, villages, and communities spread across continents. But epidemics don't arise from a single moment. They build slowly, shaped over time by social, economic, and political forces that interact in complex and sometimes unexpected ways. Meth's transformation from a wartime stimulant to a worldwide crisis is a story about demand and supply, about despair and opportunity, and about how the modern world created perfect conditions for one of the most addictive substances ever made. At the heart of meth's rise lies human vulnerability. Methamphetamine is not a drug that people typically stumble into by accident. It often enters communities already under strain. Economic uncertainty, unemployment, and hopelessness give meth a foothold in post-industrial towns across the United States. For example, factories closed, wages fell, and entire communities found themselves without purpose or stability. Meth, cheap, long-lasting, and powerful, offered an escape. It gave energy where there was exhaustion, confidence where there was despair, and numbness where there was emotional pain. These conditions were replicated in many parts of the world, from Southeast Asia's impoverished rural regions to inner-city districts in Europe. One of the major social forces behind meth's spread is the search for productivity in an increasingly demanding world. As global economies expanded and work cultures intensified, people found themselves under constant pressure to perform. Students studying long hours, workers managing exhausting shifts, and migrants juggling multiple jobs. In some regions, meth became a tool rather than a vice. Truck drivers used it to stay awake on long routes. Fishermen used it to work through dangerous storms. Laborers took it to push through 16-hour days. In parts of Southeast Asia, yaba, a tablet combining methamphetamine and caffeine, became known as the worker's drug. Its use blurred the line between survival and addiction, productivity and dependency. Another powerful driver of meth's global spread has been urbanization. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, millions of people migrated from rural villages to big cities, often ending up in overcrowded slums or low-income districts. These environments, marked by instability and disconnection, created fertile ground for drug markets. Criminal organizations quickly recognized that meth could be produced cheaply and sold at high profit margins. As cities expanded, so too did the networks that supplied them, embedding meth into the social fabric of urban life. Economic forces played an equally important role, especially in shaping the supply side. Unlike heroin or cocaine, which depend on access to specific crops, methamphetamine can be made almost anywhere using commercially available chemicals. This gave criminal organizations unprecedented flexibility. When one country imposed strict controls on precursor chemicals, labs simply relocated to another with looser regulations. When law enforcement cracked down on production in one region, smugglers shifted supply lines elsewhere. The synthetic nature of meth made it extremely adaptable, and this adaptability turned it into one of the most resilient illicit drugs in history. The globalization of trade further accelerated meth's expansion. In a world connected by millions of shipping containers, countless trucks, and ever-growing air travel, traffickers found it easier than ever to move meth across borders. They used legitimate trade routes to mask illicit shipments, hiding chemicals inside electronics, mixing precursor substances with legal goods, or sending small quantities through postal systems. As global commerce expanded, so did the opportunities for smuggling. This allowed meth to travel from remote jungle labs to distant cities on the other side of the world, often without detection. Politics also shaped meth's rise, sometimes in unexpected ways. Regions with weak governance, where corruption is high and law enforcement underfunded, provided ideal safe havens for large-scale production. In areas of Myanmar controlled by armed militias, meth became a major source of revenue for groups seeking to fund their operations. These organizations built massive industrial labs capable of producing tons of meth at a time, turning Southeast Asia into one of the world's largest supply centers. Meanwhile, political instability elsewhere contributed to rising demand. In communities dealing with civil conflict, displacement, or economic collapse, drug use often increases as people search for relief from trauma and uncertainty. Meth, with its intense psychological effects, became a tempting escape for populations under stress. Whether in the wake of war, natural disaster, or economic crisis, the drug often found its way into devastated areas looking for solace. A major milestone in meth's global epidemic was the rise of Mexican cartels and their industrial-scale production. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, these cartels realized that meth was far more profitable than other drugs. It was easy to produce, demanded worldwide, and required no fields or farmers. With access to precursor chemicals from Asia, they established megalabs capable of producing hundreds of kilograms per batch. These cartels built international distribution networks, shipping meth across North America, Europe, and even Australia. Their operations became so advanced that law enforcement had difficulty keeping pace. This industrialization of meth production transformed the drug market. Purity levels rose dramatically while prices dropped. Meth became more potent, more accessible, and more addictive. As a result, addiction rates soared in many countries, overwhelming social services and fueling cycles of poverty and crime. Social stigma also played a crucial role in meth's expansion. Unlike more socially accepted substances such as alcohol or prescription medications, meth users are often pushed to the margins of society. This isolation makes it harder for people to seek help, strengthening the drug's grip. In many regions, meth addiction is accompanied by homelessness, loss of employment, and family breakdown, all of which further entrench the cycle. Another overlooked factor in meth spread has been the role of digital technology. The internet has made it easier for traffickers to communicate, coordinate shipments, and recruit individuals into their networks. Encrypted messaging apps, dark web marketplaces, and online forums have become tools for illicit trade. Even precursor chemicals can sometimes be ordered online, disguised under unrelated names. This digital infrastructure added a new global layer to the meth economy, one that transcends borders and complicates enforcement. By the 21st century, methamphetamine had woven itself into the global human narrative. It moved from battlefield stimulant to street-level narcotic, from small homemade batches to industrial operations run by international cartels. Its rise was not powered by a single cause, but by a convergence of forces: economic hardship, globalization, urbanization, political instability, organized crime, and technological change. Meth did not take over the world. Overnight, it grew silently through cracks in the modern system. Understanding this history reveals a sobering truth. Drug epidemics are less about the substances themselves and more about the conditions that allow them to thrive. Methamphetamine's global spread mirrors the challenges of our century: inequality, displacement, economic pressure, and the relentless desire to escape hardship through any means available. The cartels, crime networks, and the industrialization of meth production. When methamphetamine first appeared in the global drug landscape, it was produced in small, hidden kitchens, basements, or makeshift rural shacks. In those early days, production was limited, dangerous, and inconsistent. But as demand grew, and as criminal organizations realized the immense profit potential, meth production underwent a stunning transformation. It shifted from small-scale, chaotic operations to massive, industrialized enterprises run by sophisticated cartels and crime syndicates. This evolution reshaped the global drug market and turned meth into one of the most widely available synthetic drugs on Earth. To understand this transformation, we must begin with the criminal groups who saw opportunity where others saw risk. Throughout the late 20th century, various trafficking organizations were searching for a new product, one they could produce independently, without relying on farmers or specific climates. Heroin, cocaine, and marijuana all required land, sunlight, labor, and time. But methamphetamine required chemistry, not agriculture. That single fact changed everything. In the United States, early meth production was dominated by small biker gangs and local criminal networks. They learned to extract pseudoephedrine from over-the-counter cold medicines and produce modest quantities of meth in cheap glassware. These early mom-and-pop labs were common throughout the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s. They produced enough for local demand but lacked the scale and resources to expand nationally. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, criminal groups in Japan, Thailand, and Myanmar were beginning to industrialize their own meth operations. Southeast Asia, particularly the Golden Triangle, became one of the world's earliest meth production hubs. Armed militias and organized crime syndicates, already involved in the opium and heroin trades, recognized meth as a superior product, easier to produce, easier to conceal, and more profitable. They built hidden factories deep in jungles, protected by armed guards and insulated by corruption. These organizations treated meth production like any other business, investing in equipment, chemicals, and logistics. But the most dramatic transformation occurred when Mexican drug cartels entered the picture. In the 1990s, as U.S. authorities tightened regulations on cocaine trafficking routes through the Caribbean, Mexican cartels began shifting their focus. They realized that methamphetamine offered them something cocaine never could: total control over production. They didn't need foreign suppliers. They didn't need vast plantations. All they needed were precursor chemicals, and those were readily available from legitimate industries around the world. At first, Mexican cartels relied on pseudoephedrine smuggled from the United States. When the U.S. restricted its availability, traffickers adapted by purchasing bulk pseudoephedrine from Asian countries. They forged documents, disguised shipments, and bribed officials to move chemical supplies across borders. Entire containers of pseudoephedrine tablets were shipped hidden inside legitimate cargo. With purity levels far higher than anything homemade labs could produce, cartel meth began flooding the U.S. market. Small domestic producers could not compete. Within a decade, mom-and-pop labs across America virtually disappeared, replaced by industrial shipments arriving from Mexico. This was a shift of historic proportions. Meth production moved from kitchens to factories, from backyard sheds to cartel-controlled supply chains stretching across continents. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, criminal networks underwent similar expansions. In Myanmar, powerful militias operating in remote regions began producing astonishing quantities of meth, particularly yaba tablets and high-purity crystal meth. Protected by geography, corruption, and political instability, these groups built an empire of production. Their meth began moving across Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, China, Malaysia, and later Australia and Japan. Law enforcement repeatedly seized record-breaking quantities, yet production continued to rise, revealing the immense scale of these operations. Europe, too, saw its own industrialization, though on a smaller scale. Crime networks in the Czech Republic and Poland refined their methods, producing Pervitin for regional distribution. While not comparable to Mexican or Southeast Asian megalabs, these networks demonstrated how adaptable meth production had become. Whether in jungle compounds, desert warehouses, or suburban houses, meth could thrive wherever criminal networks had access to chemicals and secrecy. The industrialization of meth production also reshaped trafficking routes. Cartels developed complex logistics chains involving hidden compartments in vehicles, ocean shipping containers, tunnels beneath borders, and even drones. They used encrypted communication, legitimate trucking companies, forged documents, and corrupt officials to move product with military-like precision. Meth shipments traveled thousands of miles, crossing multiple countries before reaching their final markets. As production expanded, violence escalated. Cartels fought brutal wars over territory, chemical suppliers, and smuggling routes. Entire regions in Mexico became battlegrounds, with communities caught between rival traffickers. In Southeast Asia, militias used meth profits to fund their armies, fueling conflicts that lasted decades. Law enforcement officers, journalists, and innocent civilians were often victims of this violent underground economy. Another critical force behind meth's industrialization was the global chemical industry. Precursor chemicals needed for meth production are used in countless legitimate products: medicine, paint, farming chemicals, plastics, cleaning agents, and more. Criminal organizations exploited this by purchasing massive quantities under false names, bribing factory workers, or hijacking shipments. In some cases, entire chemical factories were built solely to feed cartel operations. As a result, controlling meth production became far more complicated than controlling crops like opium or coca. The industrialization process also created a new global reality. Meth became cheaper, stronger, and more available than ever before. This accessibility allowed the drug to penetrate regions that had never previously experienced meth abuse. From rural villages in Africa to coastal cities in Australia, from Middle Eastern ports to isolated island nations, meth spread with frightening speed. The story of meth's industrialization is ultimately a story about opportunity. Opportunity for criminal networks to profit, for corrupt systems to thrive, and for illicit economies to evolve faster than governments could react. It is also a story about adaptation. Every time a government passed a new law, cartels found a workaround. Every time a chemical was regulated, traffickers found a substitute. Each attempt to slow production only pushed criminal organizations to innovate further. Today, methamphetamine production remains one of the most industrialized illicit industries in the world. More organized, more globalized, and more technologically advanced than ever. What began as a wartime stimulant has become a cornerstone of transnational criminal empires. The human toll of methamphetamine. Long before methamphetamine became a global industry, long before it fueled international cartels and crossed borders hidden in freight containers, it affected people, ordinary people. Beneath every statistic, every seizure, and every news headline lies a quieter, far more devastating story: the human cost. Methamphetamine is not just a chemical or a commodity. It is a force that tears through lives, families, and entire communities, leaving behind damage that cannot be measured in dollars or arrests. To understand the full story of meth, we must understand the people caught in its path. At its core, methamphetamine is a drug that rewires the human brain. It targets the reward system, flooding it with dopamine, creating a surge of pleasure, confidence, and energy unlike anything naturally produced. But this rush comes with a hidden price. Over time, the brain becomes dependent on meth to feel normal. Everyday experiences lose their meaning. The world becomes dull between doses. The body begins to crave the drug, not for pleasure, but simply to function. This is how addiction takes hold, quietly, relentlessly, and often long before a person realizes what is happening. For individuals, the consequences can be catastrophic. Meth addiction can lead to paranoia, hallucinations, violent behavior, and cognitive decline. It can erode physical health in ways that are deeply visible: extreme weight loss, severe dental decay, skin sores from obsessive picking, and weakened immune systems. But perhaps the most devastating effects are the psychological ones. Meth users often experience crushing anxiety, deep depression, and a sense of worthlessness when they try to quit. The highs get shorter, the crashes get harder, and the drug takes more than it ever gives back. Families are often the first to feel the impact. Loved ones watch as a person they care about slowly transforms into someone they barely recognize. Meth addiction can destroy trust, drain finances, and push relationships to the breaking point. Parents may struggle to maintain stability as addiction pulls them away from their responsibilities. Children in these situations often face neglect, instability, and trauma. Many grow up in homes marked by chaos, homes where the person they depend on most is unpredictable, absent, or struggling to survive. The damage does not stop at individual households. Entire communities can suffer when meth takes root. In small towns across the United States, Europe, and parts of Australia, meth has contributed to rising crime rates, overwhelmed healthcare facilities, and strained social services. Police departments often find themselves handling cases involving theft, burglary, domestic violence, or even violent confrontations linked to meth addiction or trafficking. Emergency rooms deal with overdoses, infections, and severe mental health crises. Social workers care for children displaced by addiction, while schools attempt to support students whose home lives are marked by instability. One of the most painful consequences is the cycle of poverty and addiction. Meth is often called a poor man's drug because of its low price and long-lasting effects, but this association creates a tragic loop. People in struggling communities turn to meth to cope with hopelessness, but their addiction deepens the very poverty they sought to escape. Jobs are lost, health declines, opportunities vanish. The drug becomes both the escape and the trap. Rural areas have been especially vulnerable. In isolated towns with limited resources, meth can spread quickly and quietly. There are fewer treatment centers, fewer mental health specialists, and fewer opportunities for employment. Social stigma also runs deep in small communities, making it harder for individuals to seek help without fear of judgment or exposure. As a result, the damage accumulates over time, often unnoticed by the outside world. Urban communities face different challenges. In large cities, meth use intersects with homelessness, mental illness, and overcrowded public services. Street-level meth markets can create zones of chronic instability, where people cycle between temporary shelters, emergency rooms, and encounters with law enforcement. The drug's intense psychological effects often lead to unpredictable behavior, creating both safety risks and humanitarian concerns. For frontline workers, paramedics, police, and social service teams, the cycle can feel endless. Beyond the social and emotional costs, meth places enormous pressure on healthcare systems. Chronic use can lead to heart disease, stroke, liver damage, and long-term cognitive impairment. Dental clinics in some regions report entire waves of meth mouth, a term used to describe the rapid decay caused by dry mouth, poor hygiene, and teeth grinding. Mental health facilities struggle to treat the intense paranoia and psychosis associated with high-dose or long-term meth use. Recovery is difficult, and relapse is common. Treatment for meth addiction is one of the most challenging areas of modern medicine and psychology. There is no simple medication that can reverse meth dependence. Therapy, rehabilitation, and community support play crucial roles. But progress can be slow. Many people cycle through multiple recovery attempts before finding lasting stability. The road back is long, and not everyone makes it. Another part of the human toll is the way meth intersects with vulnerable populations. In some regions, young people turn to meth out of curiosity, peer pressure, or a desire for energy and confidence. In others, workers rely on it to survive grueling labor conditions. Among people experiencing homelessness, meth may be used as a tool to stay awake on dangerous streets. For individuals dealing with trauma, it may serve as a temporary escape from emotional pain. These patterns reveal a sobering truth. Meth thrives in environments where people feel forgotten, pressured, or desperate. Communities on the front lines of the meth epidemic often respond in inspiring ways. Local organizations, churches, support groups, and public health teams work tirelessly to provide treatment, education, and compassion. And behind every community affected by the drug lies a battle. One fought not with weapons, but with compassion, resilience, and the hope for something better. The global spread of methamphetamine, from post-war secret routes to a worldwide crisis. Attempts to control methamphetamine, policy, enforcement, and prevention. Methamphetamine's rise as a global epidemic did not go unnoticed by governments, public health authorities, or international organizations. By the late 20th century, it was clear that this drug was no longer a niche problem. It was a widespread threat to public health, social stability, and national security. In response, governments around the world began implementing a variety of strategies to control its production, distribution, and use. This chapter examines the evolution of these policies and the challenges authorities faced in combating a highly adaptable and resilient substance. Early domestic regulation. The first attempts to control methamphetamine largely focused on domestic regulation. After World War II, countries such as Japan and Germany quickly recognized the dangers of post-war surplus meth. Japan banned the drug in 1951, establishing the first major nationwide control measures. Germany followed a similar path, restricting medical and civilian access to methamphetamine in the 1950s. In the United States, the 1970s marked a turning point. Methamphetamine had become more widely available in certain subcultures, and authorities began to implement stricter regulations on amphetamines. By 1971, meth was classified as a Schedule II controlled substance under U.S. law, limiting its legal medical use to specific conditions and requiring careful monitoring. These measures marked the beginning of a regulatory framework that would evolve over the coming decades. International cooperation. Methamphetamine's global spread made international cooperation essential. In the 1980s and 1999, organizations like the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, began promoting cross-border coordination to combat the production and trafficking of synthetic drugs. International treaties, such as the Convention on Psychotropic Substances, 1971, established guidelines for controlling methamphetamine and its precursor chemicals, creating a legal framework for member nations to monitor and restrict supply. Regional organizations also played a key role. In Southeast Asia, for example, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, implemented agreements to coordinate law enforcement efforts, share intelligence, and regulate precursor chemicals. Despite these efforts, enforcement faced major challenges due to geographic complexity, porous borders, and armed militias involved in production and trafficking. Precursor chemical control. A critical focus of methamphetamine regulation has been controlling precursor chemicals, substances such as pseudoephedrine and ephedrine, commonly found in cold and allergy medications, are essential for meth production. By regulating sales, tracking purchases, and limiting bulk exports, authorities sought to reduce illegal synthesis. In the United States, the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act of 2005 placed strict limits on the sale of over-the-counter cold medications containing pseudoephedrine. Purchases were limited per day and per month. Buyers had to provide identification, and pharmacists were required to maintain detailed logs. Other countries implemented similar measures, aiming to disrupt the supply chain without restricting legitimate medical use. Controlling precursors had some measurable success. It made production more difficult for small domestic labs, particularly in North America and Europe. However, traffickers adapted quickly. Chemical suppliers were sourced from countries with looser regulations, and production shifted to large-scale labs in regions like Mexico and Southeast Asia. The adaptability of meth networks demonstrated the limits of purely chemical control strategies. Law enforcement and border control. Law enforcement agencies globally have devoted significant resources to combating methamphetamine trafficking. Police, border security, and customs organizations developed sophisticated intelligence networks to track shipments, dismantle labs, and apprehend traffickers. Major seizures of meth in ports, airports, and on highways demonstrated the reach of these networks, and high-profile arrests disrupted some operations. However, enforcement faced unique challenges. Unlike plant-based drugs, methamphetamine production is highly mobile. Labs can be set up in remote forests, hidden warehouses, or even suburban homes. Chemical precursors are small and easy to transport, and traffickers often use creative concealment methods. From false compartments in vehicles to shipping containers or commercial goods, these factors made meth enforcement a constant one. Of cat and mouse, public health and prevention campaigns, controlling methamphetamine is not just a law enforcement issue, it is also a public health challenge. Governments and NGOs have emphasized prevention campaigns to reduce demand and mitigate harm. Educational programs in schools, workplaces, and community centers inform people about meth's physical and psychological dangers. Media campaigns use documentaries, public service announcements, and social media to highlight addiction risks and real-life consequences. Treatment programs are another critical component. Unlike opioids, methamphetamine addiction has no widely approved medication for recovery, so therapy, counseling, and community support play central roles. Countries with robust public health systems, such as Australia and Japan, have invested in outpatient and residential rehabilitation centers, combining psychological care with social reintegration programs. While recovery can be long and difficult, these programs demonstrate the importance of addressing meth as a health crisis rather than solely a criminal one. Challenges to policy effectiveness. Despite decades of regulation and enforcement, methamphetamine remains resilient. Several factors explain this. Globalized production. Criminal organizations can relocate labs to regions with weaker oversight or corruption. Synthetic flexibility. Precursor chemicals are widely available and easy to transport. High demand. Social, economic, and psychological drivers of meth use continue to fuel the market. Organized networks. Cartels and criminal syndicates have the resources, logistics, and intelligence capabilities to adapt quickly. Technological adaptation. Online markets, encrypted communication, and international shipping make surveillance and interdiction increasingly complex. These challenges reveal that methamphetamine is not a problem that can be solved through legislation or enforcement alone. It requires a comprehensive approach combining law enforcement, regulation, prevention, and public health initiatives. Recent innovations in control. In recent years, governments have tried new strategies. Some countries have implemented community-based monitoring, combining education, rehabilitation, and police oversight to reduce meth use at the local level. Others have invested in predictive intelligence, using data analytics to track supply chains and identify trafficking patterns before they reach the streets. International cooperation has intensified, with joint operations between countries in Southeast Asia, North America, and Europe disrupting cross-border smuggling. Chemical manufacturers have been enlisted to track and report suspicious purchases, creating an additional layer of oversight. Lessons Learned Keynote 9 demonstrates several lessons about controlling methamphetamine. Supply control alone is insufficient. Chemical regulation and lab raids can slow production but cannot eliminate it entirely. Demand-side intervention is critical. Prevention, education, and treatment reduce the number of people who turn to meth. Global cooperation is essential. Meth is a transnational problem that cannot be solved by a single nation acting alone. Adaptation is constant. Both traffickers and regulators continuously innovate, requiring policies to evolve rapidly. Ultimately, methamphetamine control is a multidimensional challenge that requires law enforcement, public health, and international diplomacy to work in tandem. Attempts to control methamphetamine highlight the complexity of a modern drug epidemic. While legislation, enforcement, and prevention have had successes, meth's adaptability, global reach, and social drivers make it a persistent problem. Control efforts must continue to evolve, balancing criminal justice strategies with public health initiatives and international cooperation. Only through a comprehensive, informed, and sustained approach can societies hope to mitigate the devastating impact of methamphetamine on individuals, families, and communities worldwide. The future of methamphetamine, trends, research, and global challenges. Methamphetamine's journey from a wartime stimulant to a global epidemic has been a complex story of science, society, and crime. Now, as we enter the 21st century, the focus shifts. What does the future hold for methamphetamine? Will the world finally contain it, or will its adaptability and global demand ensure that it remains a persistent threat? Explores emerging trends, ongoing research, and the global challenges that will shape the next decades of methamphetamine's history. Emerging patterns of use. In recent years, methamphetamine use has shifted in several key ways. Traditional markets, such as rural America, parts of Southeast Asia, and Australia, continue to experience high consumption. However, urban areas in Europe, North America, and Asia are seeing increased usage among younger demographics. Social pressures, economic uncertainty, and cultural changes drive this trend. Interestingly, meth use is increasingly intertwined with other substances. Some users combine meth with opioids, alcohol, or prescription medications, creating complex patterns of polydrug use. These combinations often increase health risks, making treatment more complicated. Understanding these trends is critical for public health agencies aiming to develop effective prevention and intervention strategies. Advances in production and trafficking. While meth production has long been dominated by cartels and organized crime, technological advancements have reshaped the trade. Traffickers now have access to more efficient chemical processes, online markets for precursors, and sophisticated logistics networks that cross continents with minimal detection. One emerging trend is the decentralization of production. Instead of relying solely on large industrial labs, some networks are experimenting with smaller mobile labs that can be moved quickly to avoid law enforcement. This flexibility presents a new challenge. Authorities must now monitor not only known hotspots, but also rapidly changing locations, often in remote or inaccessible areas. At the same time, law enforcement faces technological challenges. Encrypted communications, dark web marketplaces, and cryptocurrency transactions have enabled traffickers to operate internationally with less exposure. While seizures and arrests continue, these innovations mean that meth networks can adapt faster than ever before, creating a dynamic, constantly evolving problem. Scientific research and understanding. Scientific research on methamphetamine has grown dramatically. Modern studies explore the drug's impact on the brain, long-term cognitive effects, and mechanisms of addiction. Understanding the neurochemical pathways affected by meth has revealed why it is so addictive and why recovery is often difficult. Research has also focused on public health interventions. Studies suggest that comprehensive programs combining therapy, community support, and social reintegration are far more effective than punitive measures alone. Ongoing research into treatment methods, including behavioral therapies and emerging pharmacological solutions, offers hope for reducing the personal toll of meth addiction. Epidemiologists are using data modeling to predict trends and outbreaks, allowing public health agencies to respond more proactively. By analyzing patterns of use, trafficking, and treatment success, researchers can provide evidence-based recommendations for policy, prevention, and healthcare planning. Global challenges. Despite decades of intervention, methamphetamine remains a global challenge. Several factors contribute to its persistence. Adaptability of production. Meth can be synthesized almost anywhere using accessible chemicals. Economic and social drivers. Poverty, unemployment, and social disconnection continue to fuel demand. Globalized supply chains. International networks of traffickers exploit legal and logistical loopholes. Limited treatment options. While therapy can help, there is still no widely approved medication to reverse meth addiction. Political instability. Regions with weak governance often become production hubs, creating safe havens for criminal networks. These challenges illustrate that methamphetamine is more than a criminal problem. It is a societal and economic issue intertwined with global inequalities, trade systems, and public health infrastructure. Policy and prevention in the future. The future of methamphetamine control requires integrated strategies. Governments and organizations are moving toward policies that combine enforcement with prevention, education, and rehabilitation. Some promising trends include community-based approaches, localized programs that involve schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods have shown positive results in preventing initiation and supporting recovery. Early education. Public awareness campaigns targeting youth and vulnerable populations aim to reduce demand before addiction takes hold. International collaboration. Agencies like the UNODC, Interpol, and regional coalitions are increasingly sharing intelligence, coordinating border enforcement, and regulating precursor chemicals globally. Data-driven policies. Governments are employing analytics to predict emerging hotspots, track trafficking patterns, and allocate resources more efficiently. The combination of these strategies represents a shift from reactive enforcement to proactive prevention. By addressing both supply and demand, policymakers hope to reduce meth's impact on individuals and communities. Societal implications. Methamphetamine's future is not solely a matter of law or chemistry, it is deeply social. Communities must grapple with addiction stigma, poverty, and the need for social support systems. Mental health care, employment opportunities, housing stability, and community engagement are critical components in mitigating meth's impact. Recovery is possible, but it often requires sustained societal investment. Successful programs integrate medical care, psychological therapy, and vocational training, demonstrating that solutions are most effective when they treat addiction as a health and social issue rather than purely a criminal one. Technological innovations. Technology may play an increasingly important role in combating methamphetamine. Innovations in surveillance, supply chain monitoring, and data analytics offer new tools for law enforcement and public health agencies. Remote sensing and chemical tracking can help identify illegal labs, while machine learning algorithms analyze patterns of trafficking to predict emerging routes. Online interventions, telemedicine, and virtual counseling expand access to support services, particularly in remote or underserved communities. Technology provides a way to bridge the gap between enforcement, treatment, and education in a rapidly changing world. Ethical and global considerations. Addressing methamphetamine use globally raises ethical questions. Enforcement alone often criminalizes addiction, disproportionately affecting marginalized populations. Conversely, purely health-focused approaches may neglect the need to disrupt trafficking networks. Effective future strategies require a balance, protecting vulnerable communities while dismantling large-scale production and distribution networks. Global inequality also plays a role. Regions with weak governance, poverty, and corruption are often the source of production, while wealthier nations tend to be major consumer markets. Addressing these disparities is critical to any long-term solution. Looking ahead, methamphetamine's story is far from over. Its adaptability, profitability, and global demand suggest that it will remain a challenge for decades. Yet, the expansion of research, technological tools, international cooperation, and community-based prevention provides hope that its human toll can be mitigated. The future will likely be shaped by collaboration between governments, scientists, health professionals, and communities. Success will depend on flexibility, innovation, and an understanding that meth is not just a criminal problem. It is a reflection of broader social, economic, and psychological conditions. Ultimately, the challenge is both practical and moral. Methamphetamine is a powerful substance that preys on human vulnerability, but humanity has the knowledge, tools, and capacity to respond. The next chapter in meth's history will be defined not only by trafficking routes and production methods, but by how society chooses to confront addiction, protect communities, and invest in resilience. Conclusion: reflections on methamphetamine's past, present, and future. Methamphetamine's story is a cautionary tale of human ingenuity, ambition, and vulnerability. From its early days as a synthetic stimulant used in medicine and on the battlefield, to its industrialization by criminal networks, and ultimately to its position as a global epidemic, meth has left an indelible mark on societies around the world. Its journey reveals more than just the evolution of a drug. It reflects the interplay of science, economics, politics, and human behavior. The history of methamphetamine teaches us that no substance exists in isolation. Its spread was shaped by social, economic, and political forces. From post-war reconstruction to globalization, from rural poverty to urban stress, and from small clandestine labs to transnational cartels. Meth thrived where instability, inequality, and opportunity intersected, highlighting how societal vulnerabilities can become the breeding ground for addiction. In many ways, methamphetamine has mirrored the modern world's strengths and weaknesses. Innovation and progress on one hand, and disparity and neglect on the other. One of the most striking aspects of methamphetamine's impact is its human toll. Addiction reshapes lives, breaking families, weakening communities, and overwhelming healthcare systems. Its effects are not only physical, but psychological, eroding confidence, emotional stability, and mental health. The communities around the world, whether rural towns in North America, urban districts in Europe, or remote villages in Southeast Asia, have felt the ripple effects of meth use, often for generations. Yet, despite these challenges, the resilience of individuals and communities offers a reminder that recovery is possible. Stories of rehabilitation, social reintegration, and public awareness campaigns illustrate that human courage and compassion remain powerful tools against the destructive power of meth. Efforts to control methamphetamine have evolved alongside its spread. Governments, international organizations, and public health agencies have implemented legislation, border enforcement, precursor regulation, and prevention campaigns. While these measures have achieved successes, they have also exposed the drug's adaptability. Meth networks respond to restrictions with innovation, exploiting gaps in regulation and technology. This dynamic demonstrates that any long-term solution requires a holistic approach, combining enforcement with education, treatment, social support, and global cooperation. Looking to the future, methamphetamine will likely remain a challenge for decades to come. However, ongoing research, technological advancements, and collaborative international policies offer hope. Understanding the social and psychological drivers of meth use is as important as regulating its production. Education, early intervention, community support, and treatment programs are vital components of a sustainable strategy. Technology, data analytics, and cross-border intelligence can also help track emerging trends and anticipate shifts in trafficking and consumption patterns. Ultimately, methamphetamine's story is a reflection of humanity itself. It illustrates the capacity for innovation and adaptation, the vulnerabilities inherent in society, and the enduring strength of human resilience. While the substance has caused immense harm, it has also prompted greater understanding of addiction, public health, and social responsibility. By learning from the past, addressing the present, and planning strategically for the future, society can mitigate meth's impact and create a safer, healthier world. The challenge is daunting, but history shows that informed action, compassion, and persistence can turn even the most formidable crises into opportunities for growth and transformation.